What's up, everybody? Hope you guys are doing well. And now that we're a few weeks into the NFL season, I think it's time we start looking at things just a little bit differently when we're scouting around the rest of the league. And as a fan of a team that has started the season relatively well, not as good as maybe we hoped, some problems, but we have a winning record. If the season ended right now, we would be in the playoffs. It's pretty good. We can start looking at things through this particular lens at about this point of the season, which is there are some teams out there that are bad. There are some teams out there that are in for a long season. And these teams, they have capable, quality, maybe even really good veterans that they just don't need because they're in for a rebuild. And one thing that you don't want to do during a rebuild is have expensive quality veterans who are just gonna kind of shuffle around like a zombie, frustrated and annoyed that their prime is being wasted on an obviously bad team that has very little chance of being good in the next couple years, when you could get an asset for them, such as a draft pick, or maybe a young player who will be good in a couple years when your team is ready to be good again. So at this point in the season, there are four winless teams. Four teams are 0-3. And I think it's safe to say that all four of these teams should be trying to find buyers for their quality assets. They have some guys on these teams. There's NFL teams are made up of 50 plus players. Every team has some good players. And some of those players are going to be veterans who are just on bigger contracts that don't need to be wasting their time on a bad team. So during this time of the year, when your team is good, when your team is winning, when your team seems to have some upper level aspirations, it's good to look at the other teams around the NFL that are bad, that are maybe looking to blow it up, and see what you can get in a trade. Now, before I get into this, before I start talking about these four teams that I think are definitely in a fire sale kind of place, I'm not personally a huge fan of the Seahawks doing a trade. And if they do a trade, I almost certainly want it to be a small, minor trade. I'm not convinced it's a good idea for the Seahawks team to make a big splash when, quite frankly, I'm not 100% convinced this team is good enough to warrant it. I want to see a little bit more evidence that this team is really good before I pull the trigger on some big trade trying to make them great. What I'd rather do is try to just nudge us a little bit in the right direction with some better depth. So let's take a look at some of these rosters here. Let's start with the Denver Broncos, one of the 0-3 teams. They have a lot of guys who they need to trade, but there's really not much here that I want. I don't want Jerry Jeudy. I don't want Cortland Sutton. I don't want Garrett Bowles. I don't want Randy Gregory or Josie Jewell or Justin Simmons. Those guys all need to go elsewhere. Those guys, not that interested. There are two guys, however, here. And as this video goes on, you may notice I'm focusing in on a certain position, but what else can I do? There are two nose tackles on the Denver Broncos defense that I think could at the very least add quality depth to this rotation and maybe even make it better outright. First guy is DJ Jones. We're familiar with him because he used to be a 49er and he jumped over to the Broncos at the same time that Wilson did. He's a bigger guy, he's a run stuffer. He's a little undersized for a 3-4 nose, but he makes up for it. And generally speaking, he's been a good player for the Niners and the Broncos. Now, PFF will tell you that he's been bad so far this year, but there is a stink on that Broncos defense. I don't think you can touch that defense and have a PFF grade higher than 52. So I'm very hesitant to say that it's DJ Jones's fault that the Broncos have one of the worst defenses we've ever seen. So I'm not too worried about this. If you go back to last year when the Broncos defense was good, his PFF grades were pretty decent. And the year before for the 49ers, they were actually really good. You take a look at DJ Jones's contract with the Broncos. It was 3 years, $30 million, signed last offseason, not this most recent one. And if I'm understanding properly, the signing bonus was small. So if the Broncos trade him to the Seahawks, I think they're just taking on 3 million dead this year and 3 million dead next year, which beats the 10 million or excuse me, actually it's more than that. It's the $13 million cap hits they have in each of the next 2 years with him. And again, he's a veteran. He's not serving any purpose there but just taking up space. May as well take up space with a younger player if somebody has to take up space. So they can save about 10 million bucks against the cap this year and next year. Maybe a little bit less for this year because he's already played a few games, but they would save most of that money. Now, the issue here is, of course, can the Seahawks fit his salary under their books? I think we'd have to get a little creative here. We'd probably have to restructure him or restructure someone else or make a separate trade to clear cap space. But if you could do it, I think DJ Jones adds something to this defensive line. The next guy is their other nose tackle. This has been a longtime Broncos player. It's Mike Purcell, a guy who barely made the team this year, which isn't a great sign, but let's take a look. So, obviously, as a nose tackle, he's not a big stats guy, but he's been a pretty consistent part of that Denver defense for a while now. Also, originally a 49er, by the way. I think he was momentarily a member of the Chiefs as well at one point. He actually took 2 years off from the NFL back in 2017 and 2018. PFF says that he's been bad this year, but he's playing on that Broncos defense. What do you expect? You go back to 2022, and his PFF grades were pretty good. So I think this guy may still have something left to give. He is getting older, but if you put him in as a rotational guy on this defense, I think you've got a little something. He, at the very least, can be a body, a capable, warm body that can move in the way that an NFL player needs to move. And his contract at this point is very small. His 2023 cap hit was $2.5 million. Most of it is in a base salary and a roster bonus. So I don't know exactly how much of that money would kick over to us, but we could definitely afford it. It would be something in the range of like 2 million, I think. And Denver would save that 2 million. They would take on probably a few $100,000 in dead because he's already played in a few games, but they would save most of that money and ship an aging veteran to a team that actually has a chance to do something decent this year. So those are the two guys on the Denver side of things. Other than that, I'm not super interested. Jumping over to the Chicago Bears here, this roster was tough, man. I don't see a whole lot that I'm particularly interested in that I think the Bears would be willing to give up. Like, I love Roschon Johnson, but the Bears aren't going to trade him. I don't think they're going to trade their young offensive lineman that they just recently drafted. I know that they're not thrilled with what's going on with Tevin Jenkins so far, but I don't think they're going to trade him, and he's injured right now anyway. I don't think they're going to trade Cole Kmet or Robert Tonyan. I don't want those guys anyway. Defensively, it's tough too. The only guy who caught my attention in any appreciable way is Andrew Billings. Andrew Billings kind of fits the bill as a decent interior lineman. He's a bigger guy, 330 pounds, can be a nose tackle. And you take a look at this, and you can see that he's kind of an NFL journeyman, but he's been pretty decent over the last couple of years for a couple of different NFL teams. He's a solid NFL player. If you take a look at his PFF so far this year, it's actually really good, and that's on a terrible team, 81.3. He's, relatively speaking, in his physical prime. He's 28 and a half, so age should not be a problem. And you go back to 2022, where he played most of the season, his grade was really, really good. 76.4 over the course of a full season. Yeah, that's very respectable. So Andrew Billings might be a guy who provides maybe even an upgrade on somebody like a Mario Edwards. You go to Spotrac, his contract is pretty simple. It was a 1 year, $2.75 million deal with the Bears. If the Bears trade him, I think they have to eat about $1 million dead, and they save about $1.7 million. It might be a little bit less because we're in mid-season now, and they might have to pay him for those 3 games. I don't know exactly how it works, but I think the Bears save at least $1.5 million, and they part ways with a veteran that they have no real use for. They have a lot of young guys on that defensive line in Chicago, if you take a look. Zach Pickens, Gervon Dexter, both those guys could benefit from extra snaps if Billings leaves town. So there's something there. That's not bad, but that's really all I could find on the Bears. Minnesota's up next, another 0-3 team. Another team that I didn't really find that much that I think the Vikings would be willing to part with. Maybe some of their veterans on the offensive line, like Garrett Bradbury, but I'm not too interested. Brian O'Neill, not interested. Dalton Risner, really not interested. Defensively, Danielle Hunter just redid his contract. They can't really trade him. Harrison Smith, no. Byron Murphy Jr., no. Marcus Davenport, no. There's one guy, and it's a guy I remember talking about in the offseason a little bit. It's Dean Lowry, veteran interior defensive lineman, plays 3-4 end for this Vikings defense. Dean Lowry, formerly a Packer. This one is actually kind of compelling. I don't mind this one so much. Um, didn't have a prolific career with Green Bay, but he was a pretty good player. I believe he's spent his whole career in 3-4 defenses, if I recall correctly. If not, he spent a good chunk of it, and he's proven he can fill out that role adequately. PFF is not a fan of what he's done so far this year, but again, the Vikings defense is not particularly good either, if we're being honest, and the stink tends to follow you around at times. Last year, he was solid, almost a 60 PFF grade, and the year before that, he was good. So there's something here. He's not super old yet. He hasn't turned 30 yet. And his contract was a 2-year, $8.5 million deal. So it's not so big that they can't wiggle out of it. If they trade him now, I think they save over $1 million. The issue is they do take on a significant dead cap hit next year, 2.4 million, but they still save about 2.2 million against the cap if they part ways with him. I don't think the Vikings would do this. They already gave him a bunch of void years. You can actually see all these void years they put on it. Only a little bit, but they still put those void years on there for a pretty compelling reason. They must feel like this guy's valuable and they want to keep him around. But I did notice this. I did look at this and go, huh, it's an opportunity for them to save a little bit of money. We could easily afford it. And I feel like Dean Lowry could at least be as good as a guy like Mario Edwards. Last team we're going to take a look at here is the Carolina Panthers, who we just played. I don't really see anything on the offense that they would give up that I want. Maybe Tommy Tremble because I liked him in college, but at this point, honestly, probably not even that. Like, he's probably just bad. Defensively, however, there's some interesting stuff going on here if they want to go ahead and blow things up. Again, kind of keeping things to the defensive line. I'll just dismiss this right away. I don't want Brian Burns. It's going to cost too much. And I don't think he's the kind of player who is good enough to be worth what the Panthers seem to think he's worth. And we don't need another edge rusher anyway. I do not want Brian Burns. So my guys would be Shy Tuttle, their nose tackle, undersized nose tackle, a guy I've always kind of liked. He's been a Saint. He's been, now this year, a Panther. Always just kind of liked his game. PFF thinks he's been passable so far this year. Not great, but not terrible. Same thing in 2022, and in 2021, they graded him out quite well. So there's a pretty decent player somewhere in here. He's about to turn 28. Age should not be a concern. I think he could at least rotate in and out with your other nose tackles. And if you don't feel like Brian Monet is going to come back anytime soon, or he's not going to be useful when he comes back, this is a pretty good pickup, I think. His contract, unfortunately, was just signed last offseason. This most recent offseason, and it was almost $20 million. But most of it was in base. So there's actually very little dead if they trade him now. As near as I can tell, there would be about 2 million dead in 2023, and then there would be 3.6 million dead next year. And they're saving almost 1 million this year, and they're saving like 5 million next year almost. So there are savings there, and if they decide, look, this isn't going the way we wanted it to go, this Panthers team needs some work, let's just bail and get a little something for this guy, they could do that. So that would be one of the guys that I would target from Carolina. This other guy is the one kind of sort of big swing that I think the Seahawks could conceivably take. Everybody I've mentioned before in this video, everybody who I brought up in the last 15 minutes, I think you could get for like a 5th round pick at most. Some of them are probably only worth like a 7th round pick. Like a guy like Mike Purcell, 7th round pick, easy. Andrew Billings, 6th round pick. These guys, they're not the kind of players that are big time assets. The asset is you're free of the contract and you're able to now play a younger player. That's really the asset more than the pick. The pick is just a bonus. But this guy would actually require some non-trivial draft capital. I don't think it would be super expensive, but you're not going to get away cheap like you would with everyone else I mentioned. Like, legitimately, Mike Purcell you could almost get for free. Maybe even a guy like Dean Lowry. This guy you're not getting for free. It's Derrick Brown. And Derrick Brown, former top 10 pick in the draft. He is a fantastic nose tackle, 320 pounds, a little bit of a bigger guy. He's been good for that Carolina team, but he is one-dimensional. He is a run stuffer. He doesn't really do too much else than stop the run. He doesn't bring any kind of a pass rush to the table, really. He's limited, and because of that, I don't think he's a blue chip prospect that you trade for first-round picks. I don't. Some people are going to say, oh, Derrick Brown should be worth a first-round pick. I don't see it at all. I don't think he's worth that at all, especially when you remember if you trade for him, you're going to have to quickly extend him and give him significant money. You put those two things together, I don't think Derrick Brown is going to be super expensive to trade for. However, he will definitely be more expensive than anybody else I've mentioned in this video. His PFF grades are excellent, 85.3 so far this year, and the year before, 84.4. So he's a really good interior defensive lineman. He's just not going to provide an Aaron Donald level of pass rush. Now, here's the thing. If you look at his contract, he's still on the rookie deal. So this year, he's not really making all that much. His cap hit is $7.5 million. If the Panthers trade him, they save about half of that, probably a little bit less. So it's probably like $4 million dead, $3.5 million savings at this point because he's played a little bit. But they do save some money, and then they have nothing to worry about next year because next year is the fifth-year option, which they picked up. But the fifth-year option is pure base, so there's no guarantees. There's no bonus. So therefore, if the Panthers trade him, they push that money off of their hands. So because of that, I think you could get a little bit less in a trade, give up a little bit less in a trade. And I think the Panthers would have to be okay with that because to them, the asset is the money they save. The asset is moving on from a guy who's about to become an expensive veteran. So I wouldn't be shocked if you could get him for a third-round pick, but maybe you'd have to push up to like a second-round pick. I would definitely do the third-round pick. It's hard for me to do a second-round pick for a guy who doesn't provide much pass rush, so I would definitely try to hardball it and see what the Panthers do. Honestly, based off what the Brian Burns negotiations did last season, where they turned down 2 first-round picks from the Rams of all teams, I have to suspect that they're going to drastically overvalue him and never trade him. But you got to try. And this would be one of the few things that I think would be at least worth trying, even though I don't know if I'm advocating for it. All right, I'll see you guys later. Go Hawks. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to trade for anybody in particular. And we will probably have this conversation again in the coming weeks. See you guys later.